Here at the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management, located at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, we meet the needs of the upwardly mobile professionals. Our business school functions in an evolving global space where the need to have that competitive edge distinguishes you as a professional. Our academic curriculum offers a variety of programs that gives you that edge. We offer our students a doctorate in business administration. Then, there's our executive masters in business administration. Our Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management is for you. Enroll now.
Good morning to you all and welcome to Friday webinars at the Business School, UWI Cave Hill. My name is Marjorie Wharton. I am the Strategic Business Services Director and Clinical Faculty with the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business at the UWI Cave Hill campus, and I am your host for this event. Our topic today is perspectives on economic growth. The economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is still unfolding. Therefore, there is a need for information and insight into current and prospective developments in the economies of the region and across the world. With the majority of Caribbean territories dependent on the revenues from the tourism industry, there is a great uncertainty about how best to plan for the future. This webinar brings together two panelists with vast experience in the region so that they can share with us their insight and perspectives on where we are now, what is driving our prospects for the next few economic quarters, and what should we be doing to move forward. As always, our webinar is scheduled to run for 1 hour and 15 minutes. As the discussion progresses, please remember that you are encouraged to ask your questions as well. On your screens, look for the option on the bottom labeled Q&A. You may use that at any point during the webinar to submit your questions. For those of you on Facebook, you can also submit your questions in the feed. You may also use the chat feature on Zoom. As we go along with our panel, they will try to respond to as many of your questions as time allows. Now let me start by introducing our panelists. Dr. Justin Ram is co-founder and CEO of GSEC and Justin Ram Advisory Services. He is a senior economist with over 25 years of practical, advisory, research, and management experience. He was previously director of the economics department at the Caribbean Development Bank and a member of the bank's management team. He was responsible for the overall strategic direction and management of the economics department, with responsibility for, among other things, policy assessments, economic research, economic reporting and forecasting, policy-based lending, and country strategies. Before joining the CDB, Justin's experience included senior global economist with Worley Parsons, supervisory economist with the Mayor of London, Greater London Authority, technical director with Jacobs Engineering, and as an economist with the UK government's Department for Transport. He's also been a class teacher at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he was a lecturer in economics at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. He has worked as a consultant on substantial energy projects in the Caribbean, Central Asia, Africa, and Europe. He is the co-founder of the Caribbean Blue Economy Conference and the Caribbean Leadership and Transformation Forum. Welcome to you, Dr. Justin Ram.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. Thank you.
Very happy to have you here. Our second panelist is Mr. Hugh Riley. With over 30 years experience in tourism, marketing, and administration, Hugh Riley is a partner at the Portfolio Management Group, a marketing communications firm whose clients are mostly Caribbean and are all tourism destinations. He got his start with McCann Erickson Advertising and later in sales management for radio stations. As a BBC trained, everything seems to be slipping this morning. As a BBC trained broadcaster, he worked as an on-air radio personality and interviewer in his native Barbados and later became a representative for Barbados tourism in the United States, Canada, and Latin America. Most recently, he was Secretary General and Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Tourism Organization, CTO, the tourism development entity for the Caribbean. For over 10 years, he led the CTO's operations in the Caribbean, North America, and Europe, helping teams of professionals to meet the tourism development objectives of a diverse collection of Caribbean economies. He earned his communications degree at Thomas Edison State University and studied tourism management at the University of Surrey. Welcome to you, Mr. Hugh Riley.
Thank you. Thank you, Marjorie.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, our format this morning, I am going to invite our panelists to make some opening comments, and then we are going to get into the discussion, the back and forth with questions from myself, as well as questions from the audience. So Justin, I am going to ask you to lead us off with your opening comments and your opening presentation.
So I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion, and it's always a pleasure to be on any panel with Mr. Riley, who I know for many years now, and consider him to be one of the top advocates and most knowledgeable people of tourism in our region. Well, as you know, I've only just recently left the CDB, so I've now started up a fintech firm called GSEC. So I am doing this presentation under that banner, and I thought that it would be useful for me just to share with you some slides about the perspectives that I think we need to be aware of as we consider the COVID-19 economic outlook. But just to say that GSEC is really trying to pioneer the democratization of government investments, and something I can speak about later on in the presentation. Now, I always have to remind members of the audience that before COVID-19, the Caribbean was actually in a bad place. As you can see from this slide, GDP per capita on what's called a purchasing parity basis was actually for many years before, for about 2 decades, maybe before 2016 or thereabouts, the Caribbean's average was above the global average. But something then happened around 2016, 2017, where we have now dipped below. And it is noteworthy that if this trend continues, the Caribbean could likely be one of the poorest regions in the world by 2050. So before COVID-19, we had many challenges. And these challenges can really be summarized here as under macroeconomic. As you know, many of our countries are not growing well, and we have high indebtedness. Productivity and competitiveness, if we look at our doing business environment, on average, the Caribbean is ranked out of 191 countries, the ranking is about 125, which means that even some places that are in conflict have a better chance of doing business there than in the Caribbean, based on that metric. Human development, we have made great progress, but still we have high poverty rates and high unemployment rates, particularly amongst our young people. And citizen insecurity and crime rates are still issues that we are grappling with. Certainly more so in some countries in the Caribbean than others, but across all the Caribbean, these are issues we need to deal with. And then finally, on environmental, I don't think I need to say much here. June 1st was just earlier this week, and as you know, the hurricane season is here, and everyone in the Caribbean is all too familiar with the grave uncertainties that we face between June 1st and November 30th. And just to say, we have an implementation gap, and we just don't do enough things together as a region. And that just summarizes for me the challenges that we were facing before COVID-19. Now, with COVID-19, I thought it would be useful to show this very simple chart. On the y-axis, there are prices, and then we have output on the y. Now, if we say that, for example, our equilibrium, our output level was Y1 before, and that is where the curves AD1 and AS1 would have been intersecting. Now, what we have happening with COVID-19 is that we have a significant impact on supply side, as well as significant impact on demand side. Now, I just want to make this point here. It's quite likely that much of the demand that we had previously might never return. Think, for example, many people who would have been taking journeys to work, and that is not only in the Caribbean, but across the globe. Many of those journeys might never return simply because people have started to work remotely now. And I don't see that trend reversing anytime soon. But you can think about other examples where the demand is likely to fall considerably and not return, and that will have a likely knock-on effect on supplies, and that will likely have a knock-on effect on prices, something that we must be aware of. Now, as I think about the tourism and how much it actually contributes to the Caribbean, it contributes between 3.7% and 73.1% of GDP across the region. And as this slide shows, there are significant multiplier effects associated with the tourism industry. Now, here, the usual way to look at this slide is if you go from arrivals and all the way to an improvement in well-being. But as you could imagine, if arrivals are down, we are likely to have a significant negative impact on the improvement in well-being. In fact, well-being is likely to go down in the Caribbean because of these many linkages with the tourism industry in the Caribbean. And I'm going to leave that there. We can discuss later on. Now, if I look back at previously what has happened with respect to how long it takes for our tourism industry to perhaps recover from these types of downturns, two lines here play a significant role in giving us an idea as to what will happen in the wake of COVID-19. Now, the lighter purple line here represents what's happened after 9/11. It took maybe almost 3 years for the tourism industry to recover after that. And what was the reason? There was a fear of flying, and that was obvious then. Now, if we look at the darker purple line here, which was after the great financial crisis between 2007 and 2009, it took well in excess of 50 months to recover. And the problem there was that we had damaged household balance sheets, meaning that people didn't have the income to come on vacation as much as possible. Now, Marjorie and Hugh and rest of your audience members, with COVID-19, we have both of these attributes within this one crisis. There's a fear of flying because of the health concerns, and also we have damaged balance sheets. So it's our guess as to what the likely recovery path is likely to be for tourism. So as I look at this, I think this is what we have been looking at. Many commentators have been thinking that we'll have a U-shaped recovery, but I think the recovery is actually going to be a Nike swoosh. And just to make the point here, I have indicated that this is a registered trademark of Nike. This is not mine, but I think that this just indicates how long it is likely to take for the recovery to happen in the tourism industry, and of course for many of our economies in the Caribbean. Now, as we think about the future, I think it's really important for us to understand that we don't have normal distribution curves as it relates to costs and the frequency of the impacts of shocks on our economies. If you think about it, every time there is a shock, the Caribbean experiences that to a significant effect. And this is represented here by a curve which I label here as D1. Normally, if you were on a normal distribution, you would probably be at D2. But if you're at D1, it means that you're significantly vulnerable to many shocks. Frequency of the shocks happen, that is increasing all the time, and the costliness of those shocks to us are increasing all the time. What we need to do is to build resilience, and that is to move from D1 to D2, but I think even better to move towards D3, where we know that we are reducing the frequency with which shocks impact us and reducing those costs. That is what I mean by building resilience. That's quite important. So I think the mantra here going forward is to say resilience, resilience, resilience. And that means we need to reorient our economies, look at our macroeconomic and our competitiveness and productivity. that means also looking at our human development and environmental resilience. And these are things that we can discuss throughout the panel discussion later on. But I think it's also important that we diversify our economies, and I've used some icons here of wind, because we need to diversify in a green way, in an inclusive way as well. And finally, two things here I think are critical for us. We need to have digitalization as critical as we think about moving forward. And I think that going forward, the only way for us to secure a resilient future is that we need to give everyone an equity stake in the economy. And that means I think that everyone needs to have an ownership of this economy so that they have a stake in everything that policymakers do, and ensuring that we maintain resilience over the long term. So with that, I hope I have just kept it a short enough just to give an overview, and I'll hand it back over to you, Marjorie.
All right, thank you very much, Justin. And certainly you've given us a lot of food for thought, particularly I'm heartened to see that your predictions for the future are, while they're dire, there is a suggestion on what we can do to combat it, and definitely we're going to explore that as we are moving forward as part of our discussion this morning. So Hugh, to go ahead, take the opportunity please to share your presentation and your opening comments with us.
Excellent. Okay. So just let me know when you are seeing my screen.
I am seeing it, sir, so over to you.
Okay. So again, thank you, Marjorie, for having me, and Justin. As always, it's a pleasure to share a stage with you. I was a little surprised, though, to hear that Justin's done anything for 25 years, the way the man looks. I'm sure the man must have been violating some child labor laws. This is who we are. I won't spend a lot of time on talking about the Portfolio Marketing Group. Suffice it to say, we are a marketing communications company. We've been around since 2003, founded by a fellow called Noel Mignot. And those are the clients that we represent at the moment. Over a period of time, we've represented a vast range of clients, and mostly in the tourism business, and at the moment, all in the tourism business. Anguilla, St. Martin, Antigua and Barbuda, Nevis, Grand Bahama Island, and South Africa. This is what we do, and we won't spend a lot of time on that, but you can certainly find out more about who we are and what we do and how we do it on our website. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to see if I can get this out of the way. Pardon me for just a quick second. So just fighting with the technology for a minute there. So for the immediate future, the economic well-being of the Caribbean will remain inextricably tied to the success of the tourism sector. Tourism's recovery and the region's economic diversification are literally speeding toward an inevitable intersection. And quite frankly, the more tourism succeeds in its relaunch, resurgence, the more the discussion about diversifying our economies will probably recede. This is human nature, and there will need to be, I think, an ongoing pressure to keep looking at what really is needed to keep us resilient and sustainable as we go along. How the Caribbean did in 2019 was really interesting. Record numbers of air arrivals, record numbers of cruise visits. We, as a region, outpaced the rest of the world. You can see the number of visitors that came by air, 31.5 million. See where they came from. Half of those came from the United States, 3.4 million from Canada, and intra-Caribbean tourism. This is an interesting number that I always pay a lot of attention to in my previous job and now. 2 million intra-Caribbean visitors. This information came from the Caribbean Tourism Organization. So that's, I mean, certainly we're at a different place in the world now, different place in life. Literally, that's 2019 versus COVID-19. So COVID-19 brought the entire tourism industry to a standstill. We started to hear terms such as social distancing. All destinations were affected. So to some extent, there's a level playing field, though not entirely, because economic resiliency is not a level playing field at all across the globe. But as far as the tourism industry is concerned, everyone suffered the same sort of paralysis of travel. The competition for consumer attention started to heat up. There's a vigorous ongoing search for information and certainly a race for remedies. And there was a sort of reset button which was activated in tourism, creating, and this is a much overused phrase, a new normal for the tourism industry. So who are these new people in this new normal? What are their concerns? We don't expect to answer all of these questions now upfront in this presentation, but to give some context, I've listed a number of things that we will expand upon and talk more about during the course of the discussion. So what are the concerns of these new people? How will they make travel decisions? What habits have they now developed? What destinations will they favor when they start to travel again? What messages will they find appealing? What types of travelers will move first? What modes of transport will they choose? We have, at the PM Group, we have a number of affiliates around the country, actually not just around the country, around the world. And Sparkloft Media is one of our affiliates. Sparkloft does some really fascinating social sentiment analysis. It literally, they listen to, they scrape social media posts every week, literally millions, to find out what it is people are saying, so that you base your decision-making on what consumers are doing and saying and what they're thinking. So the sentiment varies by region, and it differs vastly over time. When we started to look at what people were saying about travel a year ago, again, not shockingly, it is completely different from what they're saying about travel now. Consumers are grouped in categories, so they're not all the same. There are some key partisan differences. We found that people who were Republican leaning were much more likely to do some of the travel-related things than people who were leaning Democrats. And there are reasons for that, and we can talk more about that. But it certainly puts the Caribbean in a different kind of mode. I mean, where in our history have we had to consider how our messaging would differ to consumers by their political affiliation? Brands need to speak differently to different groups is really what that means. Consumers are saying that they will avoid long flights, and they will avoid flights with connections. So people who are taking flights are more likely to reduce contact by, okay, I'm going to take a flight, but I'm going to get on that plane, and when I get off that plane, I'm going to be at my destination. They will avoid connections, yeah? Zoom meetings are replacing some business trips, and domestic vacations will likely recover first. And that is domestic in all sets of circumstances. We can talk more about domestic in the Caribbean context as well, but domestic in the US context. Now, a lot of these remarks I'm deliberately pointing towards the US because the US is the #1 producer of business for the Caribbean. That varies by individual country within the Caribbean, but of the 31.5 million people that visited the Caribbean, half of those came from the United States. But some of these statistics certainly relate, some of these arguments relate to the UK and to other markets as well. So who goes there? People will perhaps be doing more driving vacations now in the current environment in the immediate future. And naturally, we would hope that starts to change and people start to get on planes again. Yet to be determined, how soon will cruising come back to any kind of sort of full strength? We've all seen what the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, has said about their stop sail rule. And so everybody's watching to see when cruising will come back. There's no agreement yet on the timing of a vaccine. Testing and sanitation protocols, procedures, and the health of travelers clearly the health of travelers, staff, and the general public. These are things that we always have to be focused on, because no one's going to travel without those protocols and procedures in place. And we have a lot of discussion, a lot of argument across the industry about what to do about physical distance. The Caribbean has an advantage in that regard. Again, all of us can conjure up sort of images of overcrowded beaches and so on, and overcrowded attractions in certain parts of the world. The Caribbean can produce more of this kind of image that you see on the screen than some other parts of the world. So I think the advantage here is that physical distancing is something that many Caribbean countries can continue to deliver, and people don't have to feel that if they come to a beach in the Caribbean, they're going to be chock-a-block, close to each other. Who were the first ones back? Consumers, customers who feel emotionally connected to a brand have a considerably higher lifetime value. Not too controversial there. The Caribbean, again, has quite an advantage because over time, people have developed a considerable emotional connection with the Caribbean. Somebody who keeps visiting look, oftentimes people will visit the Caribbean, they fall in love with it. After the third visit, they want to move there. This is just one of those attractive elements about the Caribbean. Some would say it's even magnetic. So the people who are likely to come back first we are calling them the familiars, people who are familiar with the region, they've been there. It is not an entire unknown for them. Repeat visitors, we can talk more about that and how they should be handled. Property owners, people who have a stake in the ground in the Caribbean, they'll come back. The diaspora. Oftentimes when we talk about the diaspora, people immediately assume that it's some one amorphous group. The diaspora is not one group. The diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora, includes all kinds of different generations of people, some of whom have actually not visited the Caribbean, but their parents are from the Caribbean. Some have visited the Caribbean many, many times and feel an affinity with the Caribbean, even though they weren't born in the Caribbean. And the diaspora includes those who visit friends and relatives, but it is not entirely those people who visit friends and relatives. So VFR people are a component of the Caribbean diaspora, but it is not the whole diaspora. One needs to make that distinction always, because in the past I've had so many discussions, particularly with people in the accommodation sector. Oh, VFR traffic, they're just gonna come home and stay with their aunt. Many people in the diaspora don't have a relative to come and stay with. They stay in hotels and traditional accommodations just like everybody else. And by the way, those that do stay with their cousin and their sister and their aunt, we notice that they spend money, they rent cars, we notice that they eat and they contribute, and their money goes straight into the economy. So I get a little emotional about the whole diaspora discussion. It's an important part of the segment that will come back first to the Caribbean as tourists. Romantics, people feel that there's a certain resiliency in the romantic business, and people want to get married and want to honeymoon in the Caribbean, and they'll come back. Special interest groups will come back. And to Justin's point earlier, all of that depends upon people's financial security. In the United States, just over 40 million people are now out of work. If you are concerned about your financial future or your financial present, you're not really likely to choose a vacation at the moment. So what do I expect? A massive hunt for international funding. We can talk more about that in a minute. Greater collaboration between the government and industry. All kinds of harmonized protocols are going to be necessary. The airlines have already said to the governments of the Caribbean and to everybody else, it's important to have this sort of harmonization of protocols. Nobody's going to try and remember which island has this particular protocol and which has that. No one will be hopscotching through a whole maze of these protocols. If we can harmonize them, we stand a better chance of success. Everyone's focusing on contactless procedures, or at least reduced contact procedures. The fee waivers the airlines are talking about, we can discuss that further as we go along. And there's going to be a lot of demand for financial support for the aviation industry. Governments are seeing that already, and more it's going to happen. So we're saying that in the future, there will be a shift in the balance between airlines seeking destinations to fly to and destinations paying airlines to come. That's how the balance is going to be shifted. It's a tough pill to swallow, but I think that is the reality. Still evolving. There's a whole bunch of things there that we probably might not get a chance to discuss in any details, but more and more is going to be expected of people before they leave home. Printing our own baggage tags and boarding passes, our own immigration documents, the whole notion of digital immigration cards. When you make your booking, you get your digital immigration information entered in the computer so that when you arrive, that's already in the system and so on. A lot of sanitation and testing. People are going to be required to do things at home and show up with some kind of certification. And at the airports, same deal, sanitation and testing, they'll be restricted. This is going to be a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. Restricted terminal access. There will come a time when we're just going to have to say goodbye at home or say goodbye, in the parking area when you drop people off. We will not be able to come into to the terminals unless we're traveling. Physical distancing we'll talk about as we go along, personal protection equipment for the staff at the airports, new training methods, there's going to be a whole lot of that, and self-service equipment. I think we're going to see more and more, kiosks and the use of technology. These are things that we can talk more about as well. The whole business of boarding procedures, the order in which you get on the plane and how you handle carry-on bags and whether you're allowed carry-on bags. Those are a part of the future of travel. Destinations themselves, this is the last slide. Destinations themselves are going to have to be asking these kinds of questions, and many have been, and some have answers. But what is the right messaging? In this environment, what is the right messaging? And what if you move too early? Some destinations are saying, well, look, we're playing this thing safe. Some are playing it safe, and some are saying, well, look, we've looked at our own circumstances. We've weighed it in the balance, livelihood versus, the protection of life. And we've decided that all things being equal, we're going to open right now. Other destinations are saying, look, we're spending a whole lot more time looking at data. The data is going to determine when we open up this country. So those are the kinds of questions that every destination will have to grapple with. How do we use the technology to our advantage? Let me just say, in this terms of this bullet about replacing the old SWOT, the old strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We're not saying that we should toss out everything that we knew about the destinations or about the industry in the past. But we are also saying that you cannot, on the one hand, accept that the industry has changed, because it has changed fundamentally, and not look again at what your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats are. You now there's going to be a rejigging of your assets to fit the new circumstances, rather than to assume that everything that we thought before when we did our SWOT analysis 5 years ago, that still applies now. It absolutely does not. We have to revisit the overall competitive advantages that our destinations in the Caribbean have, and those are significant advantages, in my opinion. Re-examine the whole value proposition, because our people are going to have to get more involved in being hosts. You can't, on the one hand, say that tourism is everybody's business, but on the other say, well, let's keep the population out of it. People are going to more and more get involved in this whole business of understanding tourism. And I'll tell you what, if there's anybody alive now who does not understand what tourism does to his or her life, they'll never understand it. This is the best time. So that now that people have it in their head, now I see how tourism touches my life. We have to reinforce or decide to abandon the whole notion of public-private partnerships. Our opinion is that this is the time for public-private partnership more than any other time. And finally, reinforce or abandon regional collaboration. Well, it's not going to shock anyone to know that where we stand on that whole issue. I think there's never been a more critical time for regional cooperation and collaboration than right now. These small economies that are so vulnerable cannot survive on our own, with every man doing his own separate thing. This is a time for collaboration and cooperation. I went through that really as quickly as I could. I know there's a lot there, but I hope it gave some sort of context to our discussion. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And I agree with you. It did give some very good context for our discussion. Now, definitely when we put together the two of you to be on this panel, the idea of having someone who has spent the 25 years that you're questioning, Hugh, the 25 years discussing economics, and someone who has spent almost as long or even longer in the field of tourism, it was to have that kind of discussion, because we know that tourism is an important part of the economy of the region, but we recognize that there needs to be more. And I think the information that you've shared with us has really opened up the question of what do we need to do in order to ensure that we can keep moving forward with that product contributing the way it has over the years. All right, so let's get into some questions. I am going to start off with you, Justin. Now, one of the things that I know, and I was very heartened to see that you mentioned this in your presentation, of perception, it seems, generally in the region. Economists and financial forecasters seem to be expecting things to bounce back fairly quickly. So I was very heartened to see that you are perhaps seeing it more like the Nike swoop. And so one of the things that I think we perhaps need to then be able to discuss is, if we do not see that kind of upswing that is being predicted and has been talked about for a little while now, what really is the expected fallout for our countries, let's say? Because I hear you say by 2050 we could be the poorest region, the Caribbean could be one of the poorest regions in the world. But what really is likely to happen, let's say, within the next 5 or 10 years, and what should we be doing about it?
Okay, thanks, Marjorie. And it's not an easy question to answer, but to say that the Caribbean has been in this place many times before, not collectively as such, but certainly at an individual level. Every time, for example, one of our countries is hit by a natural disaster, such as a hurricane, those countries have to consider what we're all considering now collectively. What do we need to do differently? And I think what's going to happen here is that, and I agree with you, that the tourism industry is still likely to play a very important role for our economies, but the type of tourism and what we do with that tourism product and the linkages of that tourism product to the rest of the economy is going to be quite critical. And let me just touch on that last point. We have been speaking about diversifying our economies for a very long time. That for me is critical. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to go out there and try to choose a whole set of new industry as winners. There are a few things that we need to do. We need to, first of all, encourage our governments to facilitate more and more people doing private sector and business activity. Encourage more and more young people, when they come out of the education system, to perhaps want to be an entrepreneur. Now that, of course, you have to go backwards and say, okay, what do you need to do for the school and the educational curriculum, so that when someone comes out of the education system, they're not only thinking about becoming an employee, but they want to consider becoming an employer themselves. And I think so that is critical. Now, there was a question that also came up. I saw it coming up in the chat about what is it that our governments and our people need to be doing differently. I said it in my presentation, we have a great opportunity for us to ensure that more and more of our citizens have an ownership stake in our economies. We have been lacking that. Not enough people see their country or their environment as investable opportunities. We need to give people an active stake. And by doing that, I think that then encourages a different level of governance within our countries. Because now more than ever, if you and I have an active equity stake in our economies, we'll be keeping our policymakers to account on a daily basis. Because whatever decisions they make are likely to have an impact on the returns of our investment over time. And it can have an impact immediately. rather than us having a passive interaction with our economies through the payment of taxes only, why not encourage a greater level of ownership? And that comes back to Hugh's point around public-private partnerships. That public-private partnership, that scenario needs to be expanded to include the private individuals, that they need to take a stake. And that comes back to us having that greater initiative of owning of our economies. And then finally, I just want to say that we need to change the way that governments do things, how they go about spending money. And we need to consider imposing financial and fiscal rules on the way governments spend so that we don't have a situation in the future where our governments are highly indebted. In fact, what we need is a situation where our governments are building up their own reserves, our funding, having our own sovereign wealth funds, so that it is not a matter of if we are going to be impacted by these exogenous shocks. It is when we are impacted, we have something, we have buffers to fall back on so that the impacts of these shocks are not going to be as significant as they are currently. That is shifting that distribution curve that I showed in my presentation from the right back to the left, so that the frequency is reduced and the costs of which these impacts impose on us are reduced. That's about building resilience. So I think every decision that we make right now, we must look at it from a resilience perspective and interrogate every decision making through an interrogation lens of resilience. Everything we do, we must say, okay, is this going to add to resilience? And if it is not adding to resilience, then we have to think again and come back. So it's also thinking through what Hugh said around that SWOT analysis. The SWOT analysis must take account of the new reality of us wanting to build resilience and ensure that whatever decisions we're taking, we are now building resilience. And that might mean initially that we are not so focused on efficiency. We are focused on resiliency. And by focusing on resiliency now means that we will develop greater levels of efficiency in the future.
Okay.
If I may, Marjorie, I'd like to just add to the point about involving the population, because I think we're at one on that. If we include our populations in the whole tourism discussion from the ground up, from schools all the way up, and I when I say all the way up, I mean all the way up. You have no idea, or perhaps you do, how many retired people there are who have for years and years, harbored romantic notions about, being a gentleman innkeeper or a lady innkeeper or whatever. And for them, I mean, Airbnb was a godsend because they all, wanted to get involved in hosting and so on. And a lot of them have been places they can interact and so on with the visitors and all of that. So I'm talking about here, including the whole population in the discussion about tourism. Now, tourism, and by the way, once we include young people in any discussion, they'll come up with creativity that we cannot even imagine. They think in different ways than we do. They attack problems in different ways than we do. They need to be given just enough information as to what the problem is, and then watch them go ahead and solve it in ways that you might not have thought of. So when we get all of these kinds of thinking applied to tourism, then people start to understand that tourism really isn't only about frontline people. It's about that too. It is about people who fly planes and write, and write itineraries and who work in the hotel sector and so on. It is all about that. There's no question that the delivery of the product is critical. But tourism is it not also about research and marketing and management and event organization and legal issues and policing and lots and lots of technology and agriculture and all of those things that connect to maintenance and architecture and design and landscaping and all of those other things that stretch out into the economy and create a livelihood for people? But if you tell them what the problem is, or you engage them in the discussion, they'll say, well, why haven't you guys thought of this? Or they might not even say, they'll just go off and quietly start doing it. And before you know what, you've got another business starting up that's feeding this engine and benefiting from this engine. None of that says that there shouldn't also be people thinking about models around the world as to how you can do things differently. I'm saying that it makes no sense to look at those models to the exclusion of the thinking that you have at home among us. And then finally, if our economies are diversified in all kinds of other ways, if people find, oil and gas or whatever, and start to diversify our economies that way, and all of our eggs are not in any single basket, of course, it's a win-win for everyone. Nobody wants all of their eggs to be in any single basket, but let us not forget that tourism provides an enormous competitive advantage for the Caribbean. Our countries have God-given assets. Look, earlier in the discussion, we talked about the fact that in 2019, the Caribbean was pacing ahead of the rest of the world in terms of tourism arrivals. Now, 2019 is the past, but the fact of the matter is that you can't ignore that the Caribbean is highly competitive in that particular arena. We can't abandon that. Look for the ways to take full advantage of it while we also search for oil in the ground, so to speak.
Okay, and thank you very much for adding that dimension to the question. And I am seeing here that we have quite a few number of questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to ask this one first. What key roles do you hope to see financial institutions playing, particularly credit unions, not only in bolstering the economy, but also in empowering, educating, and facilitating people to thrive and not just survive? I'm not sure which one of you would want to take that question.
Well, I'll have Justin take a crack at it. I have some opinion. Go for it.
Okay, I actually think that well, the good thing about credit unions is that they encourage a cooperative type of ownership model. And I certainly am in agreement with that based on what I said earlier, in the sense that I'm saying that we really need more and more people, and it comes back to this point, we need more and more people to take active roles within our economies and to take an equity stake within them. Now, I would like to go a step further and say that with digitalization, we can actually do that directly with people now taking a direct ownership stake. So if, for example, we were to have digitalized currencies, or we were to have digitalized bonds, for example, then many people can go on simply on these platforms and buy stakes within the economies directly. Now, that I think is very important, because right now in the financial sector in the Caribbean, there's a lot of excess liquidity that is earning a very low rate of return in on-demand accounts. And we really need to give people a great opportunity to do something with their savings and at the same time build resilience and earn a higher rate of return. And I think that that can be done certainly with some of these financial institutions like credit unions. But what I am saying is that we can go further and allow people to do that directly themselves. So Marjorie, if you and I, or Hugh, you and I, we wanted to go on, we can just simply go on and buy a government bond on our phone by spending, let's say, $100. And with that, we're able to then earn a higher rate of return. But then what we need to ensure is that who we are lending our money to, or who we're giving our money to, that their mandate is the overall building of resilience in our economy. So if we're buying a government bond, that money should be going towards the building of resilience for our economies, because ultimately that is what we want. And then, of course, if I own a government bond, every day I'm really concerned about what policymakers are doing to ensure that that bond is performing well and nothing is hindering the rate of return on it. And as you could imagine, that then does something for governance, because now you have an equity stake. You are constantly looking at what policymakers are doing and ensuring that they do the right thing on a daily basis, rather than looking at it only every 5 years, as we currently do in our current political setup. So I think that that whole idea of democratization, and I'm sorry, I know that that is what my new company is seeking to do. We're seeking to actually try to help the ordinary person own a stake in their economies through the democratization of investments. And I think, you know, from being in development for so many years, I see that as being critical for helping us move forward, giving people a stake so they are fully aware of what's going on all the time, but also improving our governance arrangements through this daily active scrutiny of the average person, because now they have an active stake in their economy.
Okay. Now, Hugh, I have another question that builds on that a little, but takes it a little bit more into the tourism arena. And so I'm going to direct that one to you. Given the concerns about poverty that we need to address, we need to look at how the matters of how wealth is distributed. Given the slide that was presented, I think it may have been a part of Justin's presentation, that spoke about arrivals to well-being. So we saw the direct link between the number of arrivals in the region and the well-being of the average citizen. How is this relationship hindered by all-inclusive tourism? Are the concerns about all-inclusive tourism overstated, or does it really negatively impact on the distribution of wealth?
Okay, it's an interesting point. It's a really interesting point. So this has been a controversial topic for a very long time, and no doubt it will continue to be. So let's talk about all-inclusives for a second. All-inclusives make the case, which is testable, that they tend to consume larger volumes of product, and the argument is those should be local products, right? So all-inclusives by their very nature have to make large amounts of product available, because people who've paid for an all-inclusive vacation, they expect that when they walk into the facility, out and they pull a machine, out will come milk or juice or drinks or whatever they're looking for. So all-inclusives have to stock far larger numbers, yeah, than EP facilities. The second argument that all-inclusives make is that, in other words, so they're using more eggs and tomatoes and potatoes and everything else as well. So that value chain is longer when you're dealing with an all-inclusive property. This is the all-inclusive side of the argument. And again, I'm saying that this is testable. The second thing is that all-inclusives employ larger numbers of people than EP properties. Again, that's very testable. You have to have a different staff to guest ratio in an all-inclusive property than if you're running a property where people are literally just buying a night's accommodation, buying basic facilities, and then disappearing for most of the day. So all-inclusive consume more product, hopefully local product as well, and they employ more people. Now, the countervailing point is that if you keep people ensconced in a particular area all the time, they'll never get to escape and A, enjoy the facilities of the rest of the destination, and B, they won't interact with the element that makes tourism in the Caribbean so powerful and so magnetic, i.e. the people. Some of that is true depending upon the particular destination. All Caribbean countries are not the same. And you and I know that there are countries like Barbados. Let me just declare my bias. I'm Bajan, and that's that. I've seen people come out of all-inclusive hotels in Barbados and do all kinds of stuff across the country because there is a sense of freedom and safety and a sense that you can do all of this. Yes, we've paid for this, that, and the other, but look, honey, this looks, I mean, why don't we check this out? If you are in a country that allows you that kind of facility, then people will take advantage of it. The last thing I will say on that, and then I'll move on to another part of your question, is that if all-inclusives were the magnet, all-inclusives are a powerful, powerful component of the tourism sector. Let's not deny that. If they were the magnet that drew people to the Caribbean or to your country in the first place, and when people are there, they said, oh, well, next time we come back, we're not going to do this. We're staying at, Hugh Riley's house or Marjorie Wharton's hotel. We're not going into an all-inclusive. Whatever the thing was that drew them there in the first place to see what you really have to offer, I think it's serving a useful purpose. And as we said earlier, very often people come to the Caribbean and after 3 days, they want to move there. Why? Because they realize, you know what, this is a place that has the kind of lifestyle and the ambience that we like. So whatever brings them there might not necessarily be the thing that you prefer, but ultimately there are benefits. I also want to say, though, going back to our original conversation about this whole business of distribution of the wealth, the more we include the population in discussion, the more they will say, tourism is everybody's business? Okay, I want a piece of that steak as well. And that is why the informal accommodation sector began to thrive. That is why people were starting to convert, their part of their house into a separate apartment or rent rooms and so on to tourists. And that's why people were starting to really get involved in making a dollar at the tourism sector. And then the final thing is, in some parts of the Caribbean, community tourism is alive and well. You will not see me in Barbados on a Friday night unless I'm at Oistins. Again, these exist throughout the region. So I've also been at fish fries in St. Lucia. I've been at Guave fish fry in Grenada. I've been Turks and Caicos has had fish fries. I've been in gatherings, community gatherings in Anguilla. So the point is that if there is an opportunity for community tourism to exist, people will be drawn out of their property, whether they are in an all-inclusive or otherwise, and will start patronizing businesses that are in the community. And that way their money goes straight into the economy without too many filters, and people start to participate in this engine. So there are all kinds of ways to do this, but you're absolutely right that tourism can no longer be what it was, 100 years ago, or 75 years ago, where it's for some small community of people and the rest of us are just looking on like spectators. That's done. That's gone forever.
Mm-hmm. And we have a follow-up question for you, Justin. Someone's asking, is the Barbados BOSS program a good example of citizens getting a stake in the economy?
Well, I can answer that. I think the BOSS program is a good start. So what it attempts to do is to give, public sector workers an opportunity to save and to earn a higher level of return. And at the same time, the government can utilize those additional resources to invest back in major capital works. So that's quite good. And then the good thing about it is that it allows the secondary trading of those bonds. So if a private citizen or even an institution wants to buy those bonds off of the public sector worker, they can do that. I would, however, say that I would advocate that these types of bonds can go one step further and perhaps have a conversion clause whereby over time you could convert the clause you could convert the bond into an equity stake. So let's say, for example, if the resources were used to improve the port or the airport in Barbados, then maybe that average individual could then have a small equity stake in the airport. And then we encourage the airport to become a lot more profitable, let's say. And at the same time, those profits are now feeding back to the citizens of Barbados. So that's just an example. I think that what we could consider as we go forward is that we have conversion clauses towards equity. And that does two really good things. We now do what we're saying here in this webinar, that we need to give people a larger equity stake in the economy. And at the same time, because it's no longer debt, it has been converted from debt into equity, the debt is wiped off of the government's books. So it actually does a really good thing in that you allow people to now utilize their resources, take an investment stake. The government gets the money to do major capital work, which it needs to do, but the government doesn't have to pay that back, because now this person has an equity stake in an asset that they can earn a rate of return on, as long as that asset is performing well. And if you have an equity stake in an asset, you are going to ensure that it performs well. So they now have a direct stake in the tourism industry, because the airport, for example, relies on as many people coming through that airport. And the more people that are coming to Barbados for tourism or for in-transit purposes, then that equity stake performs even better. So again, it's a real win-win. And so I say that's the next step that I think these bonds need to take, is to have this conversion into an equity stake. Good for individuals and good for the government as well.
Okay, and that definitely builds on Hugh's point then about ensuring that we have all the members of the population seeing themselves as being involved in the success of the tourism industry. All right, so I have another question here for you. We know that there are leading indicators all around the world that are used to predict the performance of the economy and so on. For example, I've heard about the sale of lipstick being identified as an indicator of performance, whether or not the economy is going into recession or not. The idea being that when people are willing to spend money on little luxuries instead of bigger ones, that it indicates that something is changing in their disposable income. So what are some of the indicators that you would suggest that we as individuals, business owners, or executives should be keeping our eye on in order to track the state of the region's economic growth prospects?
That's for me, Marjorie?
Yes, sir.
Yes, okay. Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, because official statistics are actually provided to us with a significant lag, sometimes you do have to look at these leading indicators to have an idea as to what's happening. So one of the best indicators is always what's happening with respect to cement sales, for example, because cement sales actually tells you whether or not people are confident, whether they are thinking of investing, whether even the individual is thinking about doing something around their homes. So cement sales is a very, very good indicator as to what's happening. I would also say that coming through the new economy now, we have to also look at what's going on with respect to technological sales. It would be good if we can get an idea as to what's happening with respect to phone calls, the usage of data, for example, because that now would also give us an idea as to whether or not people are communicating a lot. People tend to communicate a lot more based on if the economy is performing well, because they now have to look at their transactions. So that's also something else that we can look at. And then finally, I think for our region, if you were to look at any of the import statistics, because we certainly do not produce a lot of the things that we consume, that is also an indicator as to what is likely to be happening in the economy. Are we importing more? If that is the case, then okay, we probably are doing a little bit better. The economy is doing well. If there's, however, a drop in that figure, we probably know that we're going to see that lag effect with respect to the GDP later on, because it means that the GDP number is likely to decline as well. However, let me just say something about that. As we consider more and more that we need to have greater regional integration, and I was really happy to see that Hugh mentioned that in his presentation, we have to consider the Caribbean as a single economic space more and more. Now, what that means is that if we can start producing and consuming more of what we use in the Caribbean, within the Caribbean, then that leading indicator of imports doesn't really matter as much, because then that means that we are likely, if we are to say that when I consume in Barbados, I live in Barbados now, if I consume from a product that's perhaps made in St. Vincent, that's also contributing to the overall economic well-being of the Caribbean, because now I see the Caribbean as a single economic space. But that also means that people must be free to move around as well. I can't do a webinar without advocating for that, because people must be able to move around freely in the Caribbean based on where opportunities are. So if I'm buying some fruits, let's say, as I live in Barbados and I'm buying fruits in St. Vincent, and so St. Vincent maybe has a competitive advantage in growing fruit, then if I am an agricultural, I have a real interest in agriculture, although I'm living in Barbados, I should be allowed to go and live in St. Vincent, where I can now satisfy my dreams to become a good agriculturalist, let's say, and start producing agriculture produce that I can sell across the region. So I think that that's also an important, it's sort of slightly taken us away from your original question, but I couldn't resist by actually putting that plug in there, that the more and more we need to consider the Caribbean as a single economic space. Yes.
Yeah. And I think in the end, you're probably not taking us that far away from the topic, because definitely we know that we have to shift our mindset in the region in order to deal with the real crisis we have now and to be able to move forward in a strong way. But Hugh, for the last 20 years or so, we've been talking a lot about diversifying our economies. And I recognize in your presentation, you started to talk a lot about what we need to do in order to change tourism. While we recognize we need to diversify the economy, we also need to look at changing the tourism product. So even though now we have a greater imperative, there's still likely to be a lot of inertia in the system. So how do we overcome factors such as egos, people clinging to the habits that they've always had, the status quo mindsets and so on, that could potentially inhibit progress?
Well, I think Justin's point is such a powerful one, and we might end up by doing, an entirely different webinar on just the whole business of regional integration. One of the habits that we have to get rid of is this, to your point, egotistical notion that the island next door is our competitor. Look, there's people who think about a vacation, for the most part, are going to be thinking, oh, well, honey, should we go to, the Far East this year? Should we take a cruise? Should we go to the Caribbean? The Caribbean is a bigger, stronger, more powerful, better known brand than any individual country in the Caribbean. So the more we put strength and power and resource behind the Caribbean as a brand, the more everybody's going to benefit. And there are all kinds of examples of how that has worked. So I'm not saying, by the way, that there isn't going to be sibling rivalry. There always will be sibling rivalry. And I would argue that that is actually quite healthy. But there should be more collaboration and cooperation along the lines that Justin just mentioned. This easy, hassle-free movement around the Caribbean. If there's more collaboration and less ego, that would happen tomorrow afternoon, and people coming into one point of entry could move freely around. People who are based for corporate reasons, diplomatic reasons, or whatever in one country, they'd be happy to invite their friends and relatives and so on oh, you're based in Barbados, so you're there for 2 or 3 years. Oh, let's come on down and let's see the rest of the Caribbean. You can't imagine how many people have tried that and say, oh, I will never put my family through that again because I didn't think it was so difficult to do. And we, as independent sovereign countries, and many are, CARICOM has 15 members. and this is not only about CARICOM, but if you have an independent sovereign country in a group, and you've got a group of independent sovereign countries, decisions are easier to make. That's what I'm saying. And to the point that Justin was alluding to, I'm going to say it more frankly than he did. I cannot for the life of me figure out why, if we accept that one country has all the fruit that you need, another country has all the shrimp that you need, another country has all the water, fresh water that you need, and so on, why are we buying Fiji water and why are we importing stuff from somewhere else? Now, I'll tell you what, though, some of that is going to change. COVID-19 has changed some of that, and I think we'll see our own people agitating to consume more of our own local goods and services. And that, of course, will put pressure on our own local suppliers to up their game as well. But I think that one of the net results of this pandemic is that we are going to learn to consume more of what we have as a region. I also want to say that one of the consequences, though, going back to an earlier part of the discussion, is that people have become much more digitally competent now. There are people, this digital divide has narrowed. There are people doing things online now that you didn't think that they would be, and they didn't think they'd be doing online before. People have now gotten accustomed to not just doing small things and paying bills online and ordering stuff online. They're doing more and more things online. And that kind of competence isn't going to go away. So we need to find people in that environment now. Please, newspapers and magazines, don't say that I'm trying to put you out of business. I'm not. I'm just saying that more and more people are going online to read things and do things and interact. And our economies have to take advantage of that. And travel needs to take more advantage of that. But that's a whole separate discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Because you are seeing a lot of those, especially in the short term, where Airbnb and so on were doing travel alternatives that were taking place in a virtual format. So absolutely, we know that that's coming. And Justin, part of your specialization has also been in the area of sustainability. A news item just recently about Qatar having decided that they can now produce the majority of their food locally in an environment that is not favorable for growing most of the produce that they have found a way to grow. So they found an artificial way to make it happen for themselves because it needed to. Now we have a question here coming in from the audience to you, saying that you speak a lot about rebuilding resiliency. Can you provide a little more details on what this resiliency should look like and how it should be developed?
Okay, well, let me just start off by saying that the opposite of resilience is vulnerability. And vulnerability comes from the Latin word vulnus, which means to wound. And if you think about it, if you are in a situation where you can be wounded easily, then you are quite vulnerable. And I like to use this analogy. If I was to go into a war zone, for example, I am very vulnerable to be injured physically and perhaps emotionally as well. What can I do to avoid being injured physically and to be emotionally wounded? Well, I can perhaps wear more armor, or I can drive around in an armored vehicle, or the final thing I can do is decide not to go into a war zone. Now, the problem that we have in the Caribbean is that our war zones, we cannot avoid them. Yes, because we are small, we are very vulnerable to many exogenous shocks, and those are environmental, those are social, and those are definitely economic as well. Now, what we have to do is therefore try to arm ourselves, and this is what I consider to be our resilience building. We have to arm ourselves economically. This point about governments now needing to build up savings so that when we are hit by these shocks, we don't have to go into debt in order to come out of those shocks. Governments need to build up significant fiscal buffers. However, that means that governments can no longer be doing what they have done traditionally. That means that the private sector now has to be the driver of growth. Government must now consider itself as a facilitator, so that what we're saying is that if the private sector is doing more in the economy, government no longer has to do many of the things. And this, by this I mean having transfers and subsidies for people who might be living in poverty or who are unemployed. We need to get more and more people employed in the private sector, either as employees or as entrepreneurs. So that business environment is really critical. On the other side, it means that socially, we have to ensure that our education system is up to scratch, that we are preparing our young people for the future workplace, which includes being able to interact with artificial intelligence and understanding what digital means for us. Okay, so and then finally, we must build physical resilience. That's really, really critical. If we build physical resilience, it means that whenever a storm passes us or a hurricane passes through, we're not going to have significant rebuilding costs. Because if you remember, most of our indebtedness in the region, or a significant proportion of that indebtedness, comes about because we have to rebuild all of the time after disasters or after exogenous shocks hit us. What we're trying to say now is that we need to build in a way to avoid that. So in a nutshell, we have to build economic resilience, we have to build social resilience, and we have to build environmental resilience. And all of those things are connected together. And ultimately, when we connect all of those together, at the middle, we will have a resilient individual and a resilient household. And there are some things that we have to do along the way. And this is why regional integration is so important and allowing the free movement of people. Because let's say, for example, if a storm was to hit one of our countries this year, and we still do have to do some rebuilding, it would be quite good if our people could just move to another island and perhaps live there for a little while their country is being rebuilt, and have access to education and to health there. So the cooperation together is very useful, because when you think about resilience, in an American context, for example, if a storm is going to hit Miami, then you see on the television long lines of traffic with people just leaving and going so that they can get away from the storm for a while. So we need to be able to allow our people to do that a lot more easily. That's why we keep saying, let us build greater regional cooperation, because that also encourages a greater level of resilience. And that is just one example. If you think about energy production as well, we have so much offshore wind potential in this region that we can produce so much more electricity than we actually need if we had a joined up electricity grid throughout the Caribbean, whereby if, for example, Trinidad is able to produce electricity and sell that to Grenada, if something happens to Trinidad's electricity, however, they could then perhaps buy electricity that comes from Barbados via Grenada if we had a grid. And this is what speaking about resilience means. It means that when something happens to you, that wound is not going to be lethal to you. It means that you can bounce back. And this is why we have to build in this regional cooperation as well. It's a very important aspect of the resilience building. And let me just say one final thing. Gender equality is a very important aspect of that. We cannot speak about taking people out of poverty unless we consider the gender inequalities within our society. Because when you look at the data, many of the households that are living in poverty, unfortunately, are female-headed households. And that must change. We must have a laser focus on that if we are to build ourselves to be much more resilient over time. So thank you.
All right, and thank you for that response. Now I have two questions. I know that we have gone a little bit over 11:15, but I have two questions here that I thought we could still try to answer fairly quickly. According to the ECCB, 80 to 90% of transactions in the OECS are done in cash. Since visitors do not tend to carry a lot of cash, and since more than half of our MSMEs are micro, small, and medium enterprises are underbanked, how can we enable them to benefit from the tourism sector going forward?
I think that's a gift for a gift for Justin.
Okay, Justin.
Go for it.
Okay, well, I think that really we need to consider, I mentioned this before, moving towards digital currencies and to actually give people the opportunity to do transactions more on their mobile devices. I said this before. So for example, if an MSME has has a mobile device and maybe has access to digital currencies. When, for example, that visitor comes and visits that person's establishment and wants to purchase something, having cash is not a hindrance. They can simply share their codes on their phones and the payment transaction is done. So again, I think this means that we need to move towards digital very, very quickly. And in this COVID-19 period, we really don't want to have too much cash transactions anyway, because as Hugh said, we have to consider the new protocols going forward, and going digital would also be very good within this health risk environment that we live in. So I think we need to go digital very, very quickly.
Precisely. There are some businesses in some small businesses in some parts of the world that have actually stopped taking cash now. Again, the whole contactless transaction. And again, people have become much more familiar now with using their digital device for all kinds of things. So let's take advantage of that and remove some of the fear that particularly older people have had about doing transactions that were cashless. Some of that fear is lessening, it's going away, and it will help small businesses.
Okay, and last question, I'm passing this to you, Hugh. We have a question here. Earlier, Dr. Ram spoke about viewing the Caribbean as a single economic space. You also alluded to brand presentation. Do you think that a single Caribbean brand is practical?
Well, yeah, it's not only practical, but it's worked for us in the past. So I'm not going to suggest that a pandemic is exactly the same thing as 9/11. But 9/11 was the first time. 9/11 2001 was the first time that there was this sort of paralysis of travel, and people didn't want to. People were afraid to get on a plane to go anywhere. And so all planes were grounded starting out of the United States and in other parts of the world. And the Caribbean was, wondering, what are we going to do next? So we developed this campaign called Life Needs the Caribbean. The whole focus was on the Caribbean. And guess what happened? Two things happened. First of all, the awareness of the Caribbean brand rose considerably during that whole campaign. Why? How do we know that? Because we did before and after tests of the awareness of the Caribbean brand. And secondly, all of the individual countries that participated in that benefited by increased travel, because there's some small countries that nobody really knows about. If you don't know where a country is and you have an umbrella called the Caribbean that you can use to cut through that clutter, why not use that? So I think we should get rid of this fear that people think that if we market the Caribbean, somehow or other, everyone will think that we're all the same. We're not all the same. They're individual assets and peculiarities, and we've become very well known, certainly within our group, for saying that if you've seen one island, you've seen one island. That's all you've seen. We understand how to distinguish the uniqueness of one Caribbean country from another.
All right, well, thank you very much for that. Now, there are a few questions remaining, and what we are going to do, we will pass them on to our panelists, get some responses, and post them on our Facebook page for you. So thank all of you for submitting your questions to us this morning, and thank you for joining us. Our topic has been perspectives on economic growth, and I think what we have had here this morning is really the beginning of an ongoing conversation. We've had a lot of talk over the years about the need for diversification, the need to be sustainable, the need for food security, the need to be resilient. All those things have been coming up repeatedly. And we really are at a time now where it almost is, if not now, then when? Because the imperative for taking action now is stronger than perhaps it has ever been. So thank you very much, Dr. Justin Ram and Mr. Hugh Riley, for sharing your insight, your ideas, and your guidance on navigating this time in our economic development. For more information on the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business or our programs, please visit our website, uwichsb.org. As always, we invite you to keep this conversation going on our Facebook page and reach out to us if you need any additional information or clarification. Hopefully, you will also be able for our next Friday webinar, where we will be looking at the topic of labor in the Caribbean. I look forward to seeing you then. Stay safe and stay sane, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Here at the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management, located at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, we meet the needs of the upwardly mobile professionals. Our business school functions in an evolving global space where the need to have that competitive edge distinguishes you as a professional. Our academic curriculum offers a variety of programs that gives you that edge. We offer our students a doctorate in business administration. Then, there's our executive masters in business administration. Our Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management is for you. Enroll now.